Welcome to Musical Minds and Missions, M Cubed. I'm your host, Sarah Cahill. M Cubed is brought to you by Phenotypic Recordings, a media company that brings to light new music by world-class musicians and innovative composers with a focus on music that highlights the most important issues facing the world in our time. Kareem Roustom and Justin DeFilippis, thank you so much for joining me for this podcast. And congratulations on this powerful new album titled Shades of Night.
Thank you.
Before we get to the album, Kareem, I want to talk with you a little bit about your own background and your early background. You were born in Damascus and came to the United States as a teenager. So you spent your formative years in Damascus, and I wonder what it was like to move to a new country as a teenager.
It was very challenging. It was a culture shock, despite the fact that my mother is American and we grew up speaking English and Arabic at home and coming to visit for some summers and having American grandparents. Just the actual move, that feeling of being uprooted, is something that kind of stays with you for your whole life. And it's something you try to navigate. And luckily for me, it was through art, through music, as a way to try to make sense of all of that.
Yeah. You went to school at Northeastern in electrical engineering, and then you earned a degree in music business and music performance, uh, and a master's degree in ethnomusicology and composition. So tell me about that trajectory, starting in electrical engineering and then um, your other degrees.
Sure. Well, there's this kind of saying that all, Syrian young men, at my generation, you had three career choices: doctor, engineer, loser. So so I chose the latter. But it's, my dad was a pediatric surgeon and quite well known in Damascus, and I, to this day, I still run into people who said, "Oh, when I was 12, your dad took my gallbladder out or my tonsils or whatever." I mean, all over the world, I've run into people or people who have studied medicine with him. So that was quite a shadow to sort of grow up under. And, early on, I knew medicine wasn't the right way. And so I thought, I'd try electrical engineering. And it took about a semester to realize that that wasn't the right choice either. So eventually I left Northeastern and went elsewhere. And many years later, after undergrad, I moved on to study ethnomusicology as a way to sort of kind of be able to dig more deeply into the traditions from the Middle East. So yeah, it's a very circuitous route.
And then you played the oud and guitar, I think before you became a composer. Is that right?
I think that composition, I mean, my first love was the guitar, and through that became very serious about jazz. Eventually I found my way to the oud, and to studying, performing, teaching Arabic music, and kind of settling there. But both traditions are all about improvisation. And so for me, composing and improvisation are very similar. So I feel like I've been composing really from the get-go. You try things, and that's really the essence of composition.
Did you feel that you found your distinctive compositional voice right away, or did it take a while?
I don't know that I have found my distinctive compositional voice. That's for other people to say, I suppose. But I think I have been really working for years to try to find a way to live more easily with this balance, right? This uprootedness that I experienced in this big move. I think I've been trying to sort of um, make that balance in my own life, but certainly through art. And if I've reached a voice, it's trying to kind of find that balance. And that balance doesn't mean that they're always equal. I mean, sometimes the writing is completely Western, sometimes it's completely, Middle Eastern, Arabic, and sometimes it's blurs between the two.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that because this new album with the Balourdet Quartet is all string quartet. And I, I was curious about that choice rather than traditional Arabic instruments, which I know you also do. So, what about the string quartet is so attractive to you?
Well, there are three, string quartets on this piece. There's also a duo for violin and percussion that I wrote for some dear friends, and but the core of it is string quartet. And I think for any composer working in Western medium, concert music, the string quartet is the Ferrari is of it's the hardest one to drive. It's the one where you're most exposed, but it's also the most personal and beautiful and kind of nimble of chamber groups. And so I think I'll keep writing for string quartets, but I think it was just a good synergy of things too. When I first spoke to Stephen Prutzman from Phenotypic, um, he asked about pieces, and we came up with some ideas. And then, of course, he had the genius to recommend the Balourdet Quartet, and that just turned out to be just such an incredible pairing. And I just want to reiterate his genius is matching the music and the composer with the quartet. I think he did that beautifully.
Yeah. Justin, I want to bring you into the conversation and the Balourdet Quartet. First of all, just a little background about the Balourdet Quartet.
Sure. Well, we founded in 2018 at Rice University. We were students doing different degrees, friends first. Quartet slowly but surely came after that. And we've had an amazing 7 years together now. We're probably the only quartet in the world named after a chef, as far as we know. So food brings us together just as much as music. We're very passionate about the traditional repertoire, but we're also incredibly enthusiastic about contemporary pieces and working with composers that we really feel strongly in their voices and championing. And basically, I would say out of all of the pieces that we've played in the quartet, half my favorites would be old music and half my favorites would be new music. And Kareem's music is definitely very high up there for me. We were, first introduced to Kareem through Steve Prutzman of Phenotypic, but we had actually encountered Kareem's work. We were based in Boston at the time at the New England Conservatory, doing the professional string quartet program, which was kind of our formative years as a quartet when we began touring. And we had won the Concert Artists Guild competition and getting really great mentorship up there from Paul Katz and members of the Borromeo Quartet. And basically, we had heard a piece of Kareem's played by A Far Cry, the incredible Boston-based chamber orchestra. And then it was actually after that that Steve fortuitously called us with this deal and this incredible offer, actually for two albums on the Phenotypic label, with Kareem's being the first. And we were so excited about this project. We hunkered down, learned all of the music, and then, this was actually shortly after moving to Indiana to begin a graduate residency at Indiana University, which we just completed and are now based in Seattle. But I'll remember those rehearsals very fondly. We spent, long hours right before the recording, but we gave, a very informal recital of all of these pieces on the album, and we didn't heavily promote it, so only a few of our friends came. But I remember one of our friends said that he thought that it was the greatest concert that he had ever seen live, and he thought it was a shame that nobody, basically was there to experience it. But now we're very passionate that the whole world will get to experience this album on Phenotypic. I got to listen to it for the first time on Apple Music yesterday in its entirety. I mean, I'd heard the files and the editing process, but that was really cool to sit down and experience it as a listener.
Yeah. Did it take a while to immerse yourself in the language of Kareem's music and the references and the cultural dialogue? Um,
Yeah. I mean, the thing about Kareem's music is that his writing is so impeccably clear in what he wants. We almost joke that Kareem and Beethoven are very similar in that they write a lot of markings on the page, but they all make sense. And he's also really good at writing passages that feel good under the hand, even if they're very difficult. But definitely the cultural aspects of the piece, it was a very new language for us, and we tried to immerse ourselves in whatever recordings of the folk songs were available. But of course, so much of this album, I think, is descended off of a much broader cultural heritage, such as the poems that inspired Shades of Night. And while, we read the poetry, and, looked at the video of the ballet of Clorinda Agonistes, um, certainly it wasn't until we were actually in the room with Kareem, in a classroom at Tufts University shortly before the recording sessions, where we finally got that exchange of kind of question and answer and him demonstrating on the oud. And it became really apparent that he's just such a transcendent performer. And, when he played stuff on the oud, I think a lot of things made more sense, especially the microtones, in the movement of the Syrian folk songs, and scattered throughout these pieces. So that I think the microtones ended up being the most challenging part. Even in the studio, I don't think I ever got quite a through take that I was completely proud of with the microtones. But John Weston did some miraculous editing, so it sounds amazing on the final product.
let's listen to that movement. This is the last of the Syrian folk songs. And before we listen to it, Kareem, maybe you could introduce this set and talk about how you wrote it and what inspired you.
Sure. Yeah. These folk songs, there are many different folk traditions, but these particular traditions are what's called urban folk music. They're kind of urban folk songs, a lot of them from Aleppo, but it's even hard to say where they're from, right? At a certain point they travel, at another point, people say, oh, this is from here, but then it turns out it's from somewhere else. So you kind of, it's really fun to research to see where some of these things came. Um, this particular song originally comes from Iraq, but it became popularized in the 60s, I want to say, um, by a singer named Samira Taufi, and just kind of bringing it to a broader public. But then many people covered this song, so there are lots of different versions of it. And the title in Arabic is Ya Ain Maulatain, right? And it's like under my parents' watchful eyes. And the general, like a lot of these folk songs, the young person speaking is saying, my parents are really worried about me because I'm trying to sneak off to the house of my beloved just to get a glance at her. And they're worried because I've lost so much weight, this love sickness, right? So a lot of these is kind of very innocent love sickness kind of a thing. But it just always has this very kind of nice energy. This is kind of dance element to it as well. And so that's a little bit about the piece, but I think any composer who works with folk traditions, um, it has to go beyond just making an arrangement, right? You kind of have to really bring it in, really feel it, really know it, and then kind of it becomes something else, And that was part of the process about working with Justin and his colleagues, is that they said, how should we play this? Should we play this in the Arabic style? I said, no, I brought it halfway for you in the way that it's written. So just bring your own experience to it. And that's the invitation with these pieces, I think, for performers and listeners, is like, you don't have to bring anything other than just yourself, and then just, experience it for what it is.
That's so interesting because I feel like these Syrian folk songs of yours have so many layers of meaning, uh, and that maybe casual listeners won't grasp all those layers at once. And if that is any sort of barrier, but what you're saying is that, yes, you've gone this far towards the audience as well, and that you've brought the music to them rather than them having to come and meet you with all those layers of meaning.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, coming back to the food analogy, right? Sometimes you take a bite of a delicious, amazing, complex meal, and you don't know what all the flavors are there, what the ingredients are, but you just taste something amazing. And that's what my hope is, with this particular set.
Yeah. Anything you want to say about the microtones before we listen to it?
No, other than that Justin did play them beautifully, and there's they just kind of, it's an organic part of just the melodic line, and it's just, like a different set of spices. That's the way you should think about it.
Right. So here is an excerpt from the Syrian folk songs by Kareem Roustom. That is an excerpt from one of the Syrian folk songs by my special guest, Kareem Roustom. Also with us is Justin DeFilippis from the Balourdet Quartet, who's performing there. And so amazing. I I want to digress for just a moment to something personal. My brother Nick is field director at an archaeological dig in Sardis, Turkey, which is the Lydian civilization, 600 BC, where Croesus built his palace and where coins were invented. And Nick has such a different perspective on this present moment where most of us are just kind of reacting day by day and week by week to each new outrage and just being angry and upset and irritable all the time. And Nick, my brother, teaches about ancient civilizations which rise and fall, and dictators come and go, and horrifying things happened in ancient Rome, and then time went by, and the sort of cyclical nature of it all. And that seems true also about your music. It speaks to the present moment, but also resonates so much with the ancient world. And do you feel that that's an important aspect of your music, that it's embracing both the past and the present in that way?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, a good example of this is the four dances from Clorinda Agonistes, right? Clorinda Agonistes was this commission that came to me from London on the day of the lockdown, whatever it was, March 11th, 2020, and I received that email from a wonderful choreographer named Shobana Jeyasingh. And we worked on it over the pandemic, and finally, I think it was premiered in 2022. And oddly enough, I missed the premiere because I had COVID and I was stuck in an apartment in London and couldn't go. So eventually I did see the work, but that piece concerns itself with an old opera by Monteverdi called Il combattimento di Tancredi e Clorinda. And that opera is a setting of an ancient poem about the Crusades, the very first crusade, right? So that is a very multi-layered project. And yeah, it's true. I do find myself interested in history and digging back and reading about things and looking for inspiration with the ancient world, because I feel like it gives the music continuity, and it gives us as people some kind of continuity, knowing that life's spans or cycles, and they come and go as your brother notices, and I'm sure as he digs into the earth, he sees layers of time going past, and that's a very kind of humbling thing to experience. So yes, I think that is something I'm concerned with.
Yeah. Justin, I love the fact that your friend said this is the greatest concert I've ever been to. I mean, that's certainly a sign that, Kareem, you can write something that immediately appeals to an audience who isn't sort of hyper, I was going to say hyper educated, but that's not what I mean, but sort of involved in ancient history and understands everything that goes into your music, and Monteverdi and music from the Near East and the traditions that you bring into your work. Um, so it's another sign that music can transcend all those boundaries.
Yeah. I think it was also very moving in that performance when we played the four dances at Clorinda, and I, described the piece to the audience and about, the retelling in a modern day refugee camp. Basically, it definitely got people like immediately hooked. I think in the performance we actually played that first. So right away people were locked into the immediacy of the relevance of all of this music, which I think helped. I don't think we played the greatest concert ever, but I think people were exposed to such a different world, and Kareem locked people in with the subject matter, with the immediacy and power of the music, and of course the craftsmanship and everything.
And Kareem, you wrote about this piece saying the refugees often carry very little with them when fleeing violence. They can carry knowledge and memories of song, dance, poetry, and art. And it's an homage to both the things that are left behind and those that are carried in the heart, which is a very beautiful concept. Yeah.
Yeah, in my travels, especially to Europe, I've met people who walked from Syria to Germany. And again, it's very, very humbling, and to see them, work hard to create new lives after this tremendous disruption. Yeah, I mean, these are things, I heard first person and saw first person, I didn't see or experience, but just it, it's definitely something that I've been thinking about for quite a few years now.
Let's listen to some of these four dances. And tell us your relationship with Monteverdi and kind of how you thought of being in conversation with Monteverdi when you were writing this.
Well, yeah, that was the project that the choreographer Shobana Jeyasingh had proposed that she wanted to create a contemporary dance with this Monteverdi opera, which always, when that Monteverdi opera is performed, it's performed with dancers. So it has this history to it, and Shobana has always loved that opera and had always wanted to contemporize it. So I was commissioned to write a companion piece for that, and we used the same text that Monteverdi used, even some of the same musical phrases here and there, not too many, but that was the point of departure from which new pieces were developed, and of course working with the dancers and seeing what they could do was just incredibly inspiring.
We're going to listen to the last of the 4 dances. Is that right? Anything to say about this before we listen to it?
No, other than that it's very energetic. It's very intense. There's a lot of kind of repeated rhythms in it, and as I learned about working for dancers, it's good to write repeated rhythms because then it's easier for them to count.
Nice. And this was the single for the album. I think out of the whole album, this is the track that really stands on its own, particularly as this kind of like really catchy, almost irresistible dance. And, there's so much great music on the album that I think informs each other with storyline, especially as we'll see in Shades of Night. But this piece is just really fun as an encore, with or without the whole piece, honestly.
Music by Kareem Roustom with the Balourdet Quartet. And I'm here with Kareem Roustom and Justin DeFilippis from the Balourdet Quartet. Justin, you were talking before about how the clarity of Kareem's scores and how you could just get the score and know exactly what to do. And I want to talk a little bit more about your collaboration and the idea of, so many of us playing classical music by composers who are no longer living and can't really inform us about their intentions beyond the written page. So what is your work like together on sort of beyond the score?
Yeah, so, obviously we can't hit Beethoven up with questions. We've actually, in working with living composers, found different camps of styles, basically. There's composers who, whether they mark a lot of things or not, really want to leave things completely up to the performers. And in a way, we see examples of this from history where composers will be like, "Oh, you actually gave me a different idea for how this piece could go." Even Beethoven, who as micromanaging as he could have been at times, was open to saying, "Well, it's your interpretation. I liked it quite a bit." Then there's composers who really, really insist on you do everything that they marked, and then they might have some other things too that didn't go marked. And it's kind of like tightening the piece up in a way. I think Kareem falls somewhere in the middle of this, honestly, because I think everything on the page makes sense, and the music already speaks for itself. And as long as we're adhering to what he already wrote, like really understanding the nature of the microtones and just getting some of the balances, tight. As he mentioned, like there's so much of it that's left open to the sound world of the particular group. I think our group has a very kind of distinctive sound world that's very informed by quartets of 40, 50, 60 years ago who we grew up listening to. And so I could see, other groups having a very different sound palette when approaching these pieces. And I honestly can't wait to hear more groups play these works. But actually, in the case of one of the Syrian folk songs, the wedding song, I've gotten to hear two different performances of it since we recorded the album, which is a really great feeling that this music is getting popularized and disseminated throughout the country. We heard a version that it was the string quartet version, but it was slightly unusual because they had two cellos in the group, but it worked beautifully. And then we heard a chamber orchestra performance by the Palaver Strings, and both of them were incredible to listen to, really, and very different.
Yeah, Kareem, what is that like to hear different ensembles play your work? And is it strange? I mean,
Not at all. No. It's first of all very gratifying, and it makes any composer happy. And it's always interesting to hear if there's something different that a different group brings out. If there's um, a, something they do with the tempos, something they do with maybe the attack of the bow. There's so much that is beyond the written page that can happen, and it's just, I think, very exciting when you hear something that you haven't heard before. And that means that there's more in the music to be explored, and I think that's a good sign.
yeah, it's interesting. We all have such specific ideas about how a piece of music should go, and then hearing someone else interpret it. And, oh, they're speeding up where I slowed down, and they're playing forte, and it's supposed to be mezzo forte, and all those little details that uh, sometimes we just need to let go, I think.
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I'll give you an example of I've had a CD many years ago of Yo-Yo Ma playing Benjamin Britten's Concerto for Cello and Orchestra, and it was recorded by David Zinman and the Baltimore Symphony Orchestra. And I listened to it over and over and over and over again. And I just started to know it by heart. And then one day the radio was on and the piece came on, and I listened to it. I'm like, what's wrong with this tempo? This is all wrong, and this was not right, and this and that. And then at the end of it, the announcer came on, and that was Benjamin Britten conducting his concerto for cello and orchestra. you know? So, I think it's easy to sort of, especially with recorded music, to get caught into the trap of like, there's only one way to do something, and it's absolutely not true. So it is. When there's that kind of room in the music, and I think part of growing as a composer is learning how to put that kind of breathing space in the music as you become more experienced.
Yeah, yeah, very good.
There's kind of an Easter egg that I want to throw in for the recording, which is not apparent just from the liner notes, which is that in our quartet, Angela Bay and I switch first violin and second violin, depending on the piece. And in a way, talking about the different sound of different groups playing the same music, while we do have a uniform artistic vision for the piece, we actually do have a slightly different group sound depending on who's on first violin. And in this album, I'm first on the folk songs and the Clorinda Agonistas, and Angela's first for Shades of Night. So when we listen to the excerpt of Shades of Night, you know, Perhaps it will sound completely the same, but it's a fun Easter egg for those interested of seeing if there's a kind of a different approach to the music. Although, as we'll see, Shades of Night is also a very different stylistically from the other two pieces on the album, and it's incredible in its own way.
Is that more common in contemporary quartets
It is. So, yeah,
instead
if you look at
of violins?
if you look at the history of string quartets, basically, string quartets began as very dominated by the first violinist. So, for instance, the group that Beethoven composed many of his quartets for was the Schuppanzig Quartet. Schuppanzig was the first violinist. In the late 1800s, you'd have the Joachim Quartet with Joachim on first violin and different members of the quartet depending on what city he was touring to, things like that. But then I would say string quartets became much more kind of democratized in the middle of the 20th century. You had groups like the Juilliard Quartet who kind of revolutionized what a quartet could be. And they still had a very strong first violinist in Robert Mann. But then the Emerson Quartet, who just finished their incredible career and brought so much profile to chamber music that didn't exist before, they were the first really prominent group that switched for their entire career. And I think in an interview, one of them even joked that the reason they were able to have a long career was because they switched their violin. So because of the Emersons, especially, I think now, probably half or so of the emerging quartets out there tend to switch.
Mhm. Kareem, you teach at Tufts University, and I wanted to ask you what it's like to teach in today's climate. And you run an Arab music ensemble, and uh, is it just the same as it always was, or does it feel different?
Well, I actually left this past spring. That was my I finished up at Tufts, and my family and I have moved up to Halifax, Nova Scotia, where my wife has taken a job, and her career is flourishing. And so I am on a hiatus from teaching for a little while, and I'm very fortunate to be able to focus fully on composing. Um, I think, I it's odd. This is my first fall semester not teaching for a while, and I do miss it, and I do miss my colleagues. Um, in reference to the climate on campus, I mean, I think Justin can probably chime in a little bit on that. I think this is just a hard time for everyone. Um, there's a lot of uncertainty. Um, and I think the more prominent schools are under, very close watch, which is really, chilling. So that filters down to students, that filters down to everybody who's involved there. Um, and I think trying to focus on the art, right? Trying to focus on the craft, trying to focus on what you're there to do is, I think, what you have to keep doing. But unfortunately, faculty, administrators, all that have to do that while also kind of keeping an eye on what the changes that are coming. Um, I think that there are challenging times now everywhere, and I speak to friends in Istanbul, in Sweden, in Germany, certainly, and this is just one of those times we have to go through this, and I think that each of us has to sort of find our center, and try to hold on to that as much as possible. Um, and I think the other aspect of that is to make sure that we have a strong community around us wherever we decide to set down roots. So yeah, it's just to give you a long-winded answer. There really isn't an answer to that question, but these are certainly some of the things that I experienced recently.
That's really valuable advice and guidance, though, of holding our loved ones close and doing sharing the music we love. Yeah. Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Having our
Totally agree.
community. Yeah, Justin, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, music is a universal language with strong cultural context, and does have this power. And it is, heartbreaking to see a lot of the state of the world. Um, and, the state universities are in a lot of, you know, terrible things. Like, even, we're no longer in school now, but when we had a residency at Indiana University, the National Guard was brought in while we were away on a tour. But it was just like, what is the world coming to? And, if more people can be exposed to more cultural ideas, um, all for the better. And music is both an escape and something that contains a lot of, power and meaning and very pertinent messages.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I just want to add quickly that I think now, we have willingly forgotten the days of the lockdown, but to be able to come into a hall or a church or a community center or whatever to hear a performance together, I mean, that is a form of community, and if nothing else, then the music that brought people together brings us together for this time, right? And I think we need that as often as possible.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for that. We are going to end with a movement of your string quartet number 1, which implies that you have other string quartets. So how many do you have?
That was more like a down payment, right? I called this string quartet number 1 because I knew I would write number 2. I did write, several other string quartets, but not numbered like that. So I'm waiting for the opportunity to write a number 2 at some point. But this will listen to the 5th movement of this work, and you can read the liner notes, and I hope that you will, because they've done a beautiful job putting them together, just to get a sense of what it's about. But each movement of this quartet describes a very old Arabic word that was used to give the time of night. And this particular movement describes the darkest time of night, which was kind of described as being like coal, so black, that perhaps even the stars aren't visible. And so it has this kind of close feeling to it, almost claustrophobic, but just kind of this rhythmic, frenetic intensity that I think the Balourdet Quartet just brought out so incredibly beautifully, and they just got it. When I first heard them play it, they just understood, and it was just such a thrill to be in the studio with them and hear it come to life.
That's a movement of Kareem Roustom's String Quartet Number 1, Shades of Night, with the Balourdet Quartet, just out on Phenotypic Recordings. When you talk about this concept of different shades of night, it reminds me of the Inuits having many words for snow, right? So tell me more about shades of night, and because we only have one word for night, well, we have twilight and so on. But why
Well,
so many shades of?
yeah. Sure, sure. Twilight is also describes a specific time. I mean, we have to. So these words, they're old, archaic Arabic words that I came across in old poems. But you have to remember a time when people didn't really keep track of time. There were no watch pieces, right? There were perhaps, sundials are quite old, but sundials don't work at night. So people had to say, meet me at midnight. Well, what's midnight, right? So oftentimes they would be using a word to describe the state of nature at that time, right? Is it cloudy? Is it moon full? Where are the stars? That sort of a thing. Is there still a little bit of sun? Is it a blend of moonlight and sunlight? That sort of a thing. So these are words that describe that, but in a way describe so much more. And because they became archaic, then poets would use them to sort of add layers of meaning to their poetry. So I was fascinated by them, and there's one for every hour of the day. But obviously, I wrote ones just for a journey from dusk until dawn. So that's the journey that we go through in this particular piece.
Yeah, it's a wonderful concept, because dusk to dawn is a time when most of us are asleep, and so you're really describing this whole world. And it's like, you know, Coleridge wrote a beautiful poem about being awake at midnight and sort of everything around him and what was going on. So one gets the same feeling from Shades of Night, that we lose all of this while we're sleeping.
Of course, yeah, I kind of joke that the fifth movement it gives you a sense of what my insomnia can be like. So but our brains are active, and we also think about night as something to fear, dark, and that, or the unknown in so many ways. But at the same time, the unknown is also exciting and something that we're drawn to. So yes, it is all of these things.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for joining me today.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to M Cubed from Phenotypic Recordings, co-founded by Michael Hostetler and Stephen Pretzman. The music you heard on today's show is available on Bandcamp and wherever music is streamed. There are links in the show notes. Today's program was produced by AJ Machado, and I'm your host, Sarah Cahill. Please follow or subscribe so you know whenever we post a new show. You can reach us at info@phenotypicrecordings.com, and we're always glad to hear from you.